Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. Nice hat, Shamika. And our guest this week is Bret Stephens. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and New York Times columnist. Bret, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Charles.
So I want to cover as much as I can with you because you write about everything. We don't tend to talk about politics as a specific topic that often, so this is one of those times that will be an exception, I guess. And I want to start off with our president. So Biden, let's start off with some kind of assessment, I guess. We're close to a year in. So how's the big man doing, Bret?
Not well. In 2 words, in 3 words, really not well.
I could give people a spoiler that your most recent article is he must not run again and he must say it right now.
Well, that's a
So
separate
that's more
story.
age, I know.
That's a separate story. Look, I voted for him, so I should declare that. I used to vote.
You can
for
start
Republicans.
already. You looked away, Bret. You missed the faces.
I voted for him, and it's been a source of disappointment because I think he has misread his mandate. He was elected to be a calming and transitional figure who would hopefully use his long history in the Senate and some record of bipartisanship. I know it's sometimes exaggerated for political purposes, to settle the country down a little bit like Jerry Ford after Richard Nixon. And instead, he's gotten it in his head that he wants to be FDR and LBJ rolled into one at a moment when that's not what the country asked for and it's not what the country needs. We didn't ask for it. We were voting for a guy who was supposed to be the least progressive Democrat on that stage or on those stages back during the Democratic primaries. And it's not what we need in the sense that we have a series of crises roiling the country, a crisis of urban decay and rising homicides, a crisis of a pandemic that isn't going away, a crisis of a spike in prices that is also not going away and is particularly hurting the working class. And he has an agenda that isn't built for that, doesn't even seem to be responsive. So my assessment of the first 10 months, 11 months of his presidency, I got to tell you, Charles, is pretty bleak. Nothing personal. I have no personal animus against the president, but it's not been a wild success, to put it mildly.
Well, I usually open with the big question and go to Will or Shamika, and I don't like to step on their toes, but I got to go back. You hit me right from the start because you said, well, it's not what they voted for, and you described what people voted for. But is that what they voted for? I felt that people were just voting for. I don't want to sound like Obama, but they were voting for change. They were voting for the anti-Trump. They didn't want to, not the Democrats, I mean, but most of the independents, the people who don't like Trump, whatever the case, they were voting. They didn't think they were getting, now they did probably think they were going to get less progressive than the other progressive people on the stage, but they knew they were going to get a progressive. And I agree that they probably thought it was going to be calming, but they thought it was going to be calming because it's not Trump, not really because, Joe Biden was going to be some statesman. So did they really think they were going to get something different?
Well, I mean, of course, it depends on who you're talking about, right? I mean, many voters, much of his base voted for him thinking he was going to be the kind of Democrat he talked about. But my sense of it is he won on the votes of people who might have voted for Trump in 2016 or had not voted at all and simply were sick of 4 years of noise and drama in the White House and thought, well, Joe Biden looks like a safe pair of hands. He's been in Washington for close to 50 years. He's old. He's grandfatherly. He kept insisting on one stage after another that he was not Elizabeth Warren, not Bernie Sanders, not the far left of his party, that he was a guy who could bring Republicans and Democrats together. That was, I think, that was the sales point, right? I mean, that was what was being communicated. I don't think if Biden had stood on those stages and said, "I'm going to attempt to be the most socially transformational president since Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, if not before then," we might have had a different result in last November.
Right.
So I do think that Americans voted for a calming, soothing, transitional, grandfatherly figure. We're not getting that, and it's going to be devastating, I think, for the Democrats in the midterms. It already was last month's elections, and if Biden doesn't declare that he won't run and let Democrats find a more suitable candidate, I think they will lose and lose badly in 3 years' time.
Well, I'm going to go to Will, but the only thing I want to say is I think you're right. But what I think he was saying was he knew that there were a number of people that did not like the taste of Trump, but they weren't, progressives. So if I can convince you that I'm not a progressive, you'll vote for me. I don't think he was really talking to the base because he kind of felt he had that tied up. It was, look, vote for me. I know you won't like many of my policies, but I'm not crazy left, and I ain't Trump. That he couldn't say it that way, but that's what I heard when I heard him talk. I ain't crazy and I ain't Trump. That should be the banner.
Right. And the biggest issue is that the party itself has moved so far to the left that to be a moderate Democrat now
To be a Republican
is
almost.
like considerably to the left of, say, even where President Obama was when he ran in '08.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. Will?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that assessment. I'm a lot less right wing than I'm sometimes accused of being, but I will say, I mean, Joe Biden has one of the worst starting first year records that I can remember for a president. I mean, I wrote down some notes here. He essentially lost a war. I mean, we pulled entirely out of Afghanistan. There's still citizens stuck there. As right wing media reminds us every night, I think Sean Hannity's on 168 days. We're seeing near record inflation. It's not quite up to Carter levels, not quite. There have been more COVID deaths under Joe Biden, who claimed he would stop the pandemic dead, than there were under Donald Trump. I mean, crime, at least if you're talking about homicide, is back up to 1994 levels. We had 20,000 murders for the first time since the end of the crack epidemic, since Rudy Giuliani. I mean, just almost everything. There was nothing. Another thing that I will point out here, because I could go on with that, but I think the core points have been made, as it were. One of the things that gets to me is the comment that people thought Biden, there was no reason not to think he wouldn't be a highly functional, sort of grandfatherly individual. I think there was pretty significant warning, and I'm sure Bret will have a very coherent take on this. I've read some of the columns. I like the last one. He needs to announce he's not running again. But Joe Biden didn't campaign. I mean, he very famously, this was again criticized throughout the entire right. He was either afraid of COVID or just thought he'd be non-functional on the stage. He was mocked by Trump for hiding in his basement. I mean, I don't think there was any doubt among most of the intelligentsia that the Hunter Biden laptop was real. His son is on camera smoking crack with potentially underage prostitutes. You can talk about how much that matters, but he or someone is specifically referred to as the big guy who's involved in this in a number of emails. Biden's around 80. He's been accused of mental decline. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but you can see him speak. There's some things going on. So to me, I mean, Biden's done an extremely poor job. And a lot of this was pretty predictable beforehand. I mean, you could ask, why is this established, well-known politician not even campaigning? What's going on with this potentially massive in-family scandal? And to me, I think, and I don't necessarily think Bret or Charles would disagree with this, but there was such desperation to get Trump out of office. And Trump obviously did a series of embarrassing and ridiculous things, at least near the end of the presidency, but that almost anyone who made it on the Dem ticket would have been voted for by a lot of people. So what you saw was first of all, what you saw the entire 4 years, kind of last point for me, was hysterical negative coverage of Trump. At one point, mainstream media coverage of Trump, and this is well before that could even arguably have been justified, was 93% negative across the Post, the Times, so on. And then you saw almost reverential coverage of Biden, this non-functional 80-year-old guy. Non-functional 80-year-old guy wins, and he's acting like a non-functional 80-year-old guy. I'm not surprised by this. I agree Biden should not run again, to say the least. But the question of Biden over Trump really gets that. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump would have done a worse job. I think that he would have angered a lot of people with potentially offensive remarks or something like that. I don't necessarily think there would have been more COVID deaths under Trump. So maybe I have the luxury of coming from the middle or even the other party, but I'm not terribly surprised. And of course, he hasn't done especially well.
But I think we can get into some of the specifics as to what specifically he's done or hasn't done. But I want Shamika to give me her comments first.
Salabrada, that's Bidenese. In English or Shamikanese, he sucks. And I am not surprised because I never thought he was going to do a good job. You know, I appeal to people a lot that say, I don't get into politics. So for those that don't get into politics, what I can tell you is that for those of us that make gumbo for Christmas, it's going to be hella expensive because everything has gone up. And I tweeted today, I can't believe Black people voted for higher crab leg prices. They are outrageous. The gas is outrageous. I know people, like for myself, I filled up my car twice because I have to get 93, which is, of course, the most expensive. And I just would rather fill up my children's car who gets the 87 and drive their cars. It's terrible. Things are terrible. We look like we have an incompetent fool in office. And I know people would say that about Trump, but at least he was coherent. At least it seemed like, you know, we knew what he was talking about. He could speak in intelligible English that we could understand. Now we have this man in office who looks like he wets the bed. He certainly wets himself when he's awake. So I feel like he wets himself when he's sleeping. And I just think people are looking at us like we are very weak as a country. I'm seeing policies that are just going way too far left. He sucks for me if you didn't get that already. I'm not happy.
Well, Brett, I
If
know
I
we're
can
going to give
make
you
one more very quick comment there, I'm sure Brett, or for that matter, the other members of the panel, might point out some real negative things that Trump did. But you also can't ignore the fact that a lot of the anger directed at Trump was directed at sort of presentation, arrogance, the idea that he was a racist, this sort of thing. And a lot of it was also just complete bullshit. Like we saw 3 years of just mass media nonsense about Trump being a Russian asset. In terms of actual, I guess in one sentence, in terms of actual reality, I don't see Biden's policies as really being an improvement in any significant sector.
Well, I know we're giving you a lot to chew on there, Brett, but I got to add one more piece because I'm like shaking over here that I went through 3 people with 3 different deliveries and nobody hit on this. I thought I was going to lose my point. And Brett started by saying he couldn't vote for Trump for whatever reasons. And I mentioned to him that I wanted to speak to someone who's considered himself conservative who felt that way because there's a lot of things I didn't like about Trump. But I don't even worry about it from a political standpoint because I'm not a Republican, have no party to leave. But I write a lot on the culture, so I saw this coming. So I saw whoever won in the Democrat side doing this. And so we talk about gas prices, COVID, Afghanistan, the other thing. You missed the biggest thing in the room. The thing that made me not vote for him was I want all of the government to be focused on racial equity. Every department, every piece, every single thing we do, we will do through a racist lens. I wrote my last book in 17. I said this was going to happen, didn't know it was going to be Joe Biden. I said, whoever the Democrat person is, that's what they're going to do. And since I look at culture first, that to me is more dangerous than anything anybody else could do. Because I would assume that none of us we all thought that as the culture in the country moved to the left, that it would get bad. I don't think any of us thought it would be this bad. I thought it would get this bad, but not this fast. I saw 8 years away, not this bad. So I'm just saying all of this stuff we get, the transgender sports, the government and this, all of that was coming behind whoever beat Trump. And that was my concern. So what do you think about that?
Well, no, I mean, I agree. Look, there has been, I think, a something approaching a cultural revolution in the country that has sort of happened almost as swiftly as the 60s happened, so to speak. Between 1965 and 1970, the country changed dramatically. Following legitimate, hugely significant and important civil rights gains, there was the other side of the 60s. And I think what we've witnessed in the last 5 years has been every bit as dramatic. And I've written about this, by the way, many, many times, which is that the new racism is not going to solve the old racism. That the concept of anti-racism that you're getting from Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, DEI as it is generally being constructed and implemented, which in many cases seems to me Orwellian because every word means the opposite of its common English usage,
Right.
is hugely problematic. And the fact that the president has attempted to use the power of government to implement this in ways that are nakedly discriminatory and antithetical to basic traditions of fairness is a huge problem. It's a huge problem actually for the Democratic Party, because what the Democrats are doing is they are driving a huge wedge inside their own party. I can't tell you how many times I've been talking to people who are way to the left of me, and I've known them for years, and they would never dream of voting for a Republican. They never would have voted for Trump. And they are whispering to me, I just can't take, I mean, they use the term wokeness, which I guess somehow in the last 12 months fell out of fashion and no one told us. But I just can't take it because it seems nakedly discriminatory. It seems that everyone now is required to be judged on the one thing we should never be judged on, which is our skin tone, right? And it's profoundly problematic that Biden has kind of invested the energies of the federal government into this. But I think it's actually going to be deeply destructive to his own party because it's driving a lot of middle of the road liberals into the camp of the old conservative camp. If I felt more enthusiastic about the Republican Party, I might even be happy about that. My feelings now are somewhat mixed in terms of the political consequences. But your point, Charles, I think is extraordinarily well taken, which is that in addition to the basic policy failures from Afghanistan to inflation and so on, and Shamika's absolutely right. Just sorry to digress, but I went to a grocery store today to buy some toilet paper, a few logs, and some garbage bags. And I admit I got the expensive toilet paper, but for what amounted to a handful of items, I had $100 bill. And this was not at Whole Foods. This was at a pretty average grocery store in northern Westchester. My jaw basically hit the ground. So we have these policy failures coming from the Democratic Party, and on top of it is a gigantic cultural failure, which is the inability to understand that the American people are not where the faculty lounge at NYU happens to be politically, and it's never going to be there so long as we're a country that's basically dedicated to principles of fairness, quality of opportunity, and judging people by the content of their character.
But Bret, I have to say the reason why I was so eager to talk, not particularly you, I wanted somebody that's even more rabid than you, but I wanted to talk to those true conservatives who understand and love America and have this big problem with Trump. And I don't want to spend too much time on Trump, so I don't want to go down the laundry list of bad things that he did or bad things about him. But my thing is really simple. It's you're right that it may help the GOP down the road or whatever happens, but look at how much damage it would have done. I'm so pissed off about because I was yelling at people. I was on conservative radio talking about this, and they were like, "Why you keep talking about race all the time? Why are you talking about gender? It's an election year." I'm like, "You don't understand." And I would say, whatever the faults of Trump, Kamala, Biden, whomever, I will take any of the lot of them If you can get, I take COVID, I wear a mask all the time, I get the extra jab. If you could guarantee me that I don't have to talk to my 5-year-old about why his teacher is saying, telling him what gender she wants to be called, and tell him her pronouns, why he's not getting culturally relevant math, and why we're not talking about walking around the country talking about all white people are racist, and if you don't agree with it, then you're a racist. And this is madness. So that you can't tell. I don't think you can sell me on one thing that Trump did that's worse than telling 5-year-olds that racism is everywhere. My black son is worse off now than anything Trump could do. Russia collusion. What else did he do? Stealing,
He
he
didn't
be
really
stealing
do
money.
that.
That's corrupt politicians all the time.
Well, hang on. Let me
Everywhere.
push back at you. Or
Okay,
maybe
so
Bill.
tell. I want to know what he could have done that's worse than this.
January 6th.
He did January 6th?
Yeah,
Yes.
that doesn't.
Yes, he did January 6th.
Not true. And even
He
if he
did
did,
nothing.
January
He
6th
did
is not
nothing.
worse.
He did nothing.
January 6th is not worse because there were no weapons and nobody
Yeah.
took down Congress. So you're going to tell me if he, okay, so if he got on the microphone, which none of us will say he did, and say, I want you all to go in there and go after AOC. Should he go
Wait,
to jail?
hang on a second. Hang on. Okay, hang on a second. And
Okay.
I didn't know this was where the conversation was
I didn't
going.
know either, but you just said January 6th is worse than what they're doing to
January
kids in
6th, January
school.
6th was a national atrocity
It is.
inspired by the president, not stopped by the president.
Was it a government takeover?
Never mind the riot and the riot and the assault on Congress itself, but the drumbeat of pressure on Vice President Pence not to certify.
But that's two separate things. I don't think that's worse.
Well, no, they're part of the same. They're part of the same story, and that's why I'm sorry, but this is a bridge. For me, it's a bridge way too far. There's an old joke. Well, I can't tell it because it's off color. It's a dirty joke.
Clearly, you've never
can
been
tell
on
it here.
Cut the Bull.
No, I can't tell it here.
Will said tell it. Go ahead.
It has to do with a person whose life is impeccable, but he has sex with one animal. I mean, it was an atrocity, and frankly, I don't think conservatives are reckoning in a seriously honest way. And by the way, before January 6th, the nonstop drumbeat of efforts to discredit
About the election?
certified results of the election. You can say that certain ways in which certain allowances in Pennsylvania and so forth shouldn't have been done, but all of those were legal. He was turned back at every turn by judges he himself had appointed.
Well,
and we act as if none of this happened. If Hillary Clinton had been president and had tried to pull that kind of shit, since this is a show called Cut the Bullshit, right?
That's right.
Hillary Clinton had been president and had tried to pull that kind of thing, right? Conservatives would be saying precisely the same thing that I am, or actually many
You're
liberals are
100%
now.
right. I got to let Will and Shamika get in there, but I got to shut up too. But what I'm saying, Brett, what you're missing is you're saying that is worse than telling an 8-year-old he can change his gender and hiding it from his parents. You're saying that is worse than saying that he got cheated. So he cried about getting cheated. And they said but the media did a lot of that, saying he won't leave. We need the military to get him leave. He left, didn't he?
Trump didn't get
Right.
cheated, but I mean, the one thing I will say here is that we're not talking in a neutral vacuum. So, I mean, there are two parties in the country. If you want to talk about rioting, I mean, my take about this would be that throughout all of 2020,
January 6th was not worse than 2020.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. We saw never before seen riots. Like in Minneapolis, an active police station, and a famous one, by the way, the old 3rd Precinct, was set on fire and burnt to the ground with the officers
And the woman you
initially
voted
in it.
for bailed those people out.
Yeah, but that's what I'm
I don't
saying.
think
So,
that- I don't think that's
guys,
a
let me
legitimate
finish this
comparison.
like 30-second phase
okay.
here, because then I want to hear what everyone has to say. But like, yeah, the old 3rd Precinct burnt to the ground. The only reason the cops weren't all burnt alive is that one of them kicked out the back door. And this just went on and on. Like in Seattle, an armed group took over a neighborhood literally called Capitol Hill and set up their own wacko would-be nation state. There's something like 7 people shot and killed at the border. I mean, the Portland courthouse, if we're talking about federal buildings, was attacked for something like 103 days in a row. I mean, I know they celebrated the 100th day that this went on. Like the Mag Mile in Chicago was looted. I think someone was killed there too. And throughout all this, people in the other party were consistently praising the rioters. We're talking about bailing them out. Kamala Harris gave money to the Minneapolis Freedom Fund, which is the group that was specifically getting arrested violent rioters out of jail. Like Maxine Waters went there, I think the day before the Derek Chauvin verdict, and said we won't accept anything but a murder conviction. So, I mean, I think that there's been an almost hysterical focus on January 6th, which strikes me personally as one of a year full of ugly riots that were endorsed in large part by one of the major political parties in the country. But I mean, I guess I would actually close with a question, Brett, and then that's really it for me on this thread. If you had the option again to vote for either Trump or Biden, would you have voted for Biden again?
Yes.
Yep.
Because if you can't, if you're going to have, even if you acknowledge, if you make the case that Biden is a failure and a crook, which he might be, and I've written about it. I have written columns in the New York Times pointing out Hunter Biden's art sales, the 10% for the big guideline, and all the rest of it. I'd rather replace my crooks than reelect them. But just very briefly, and I'm sure we could spend the whole hour on
We'll
this.
have to move on.
Look, everything you said, Will, I endorse completely, and the Democratic semi-endorsements of semi-endorsement, looking the other way, excuse making, etc., for as you put it, hundreds of days of rioting.
They're openly praising the rioters. I mean, that's my only interruption. But things like we're out there fighting for freedom. I mean, Maxine Waters.
For sure. And so, if you're pointing out hypocrisy, that's perfectly well taken. The difference is that this was the president of the United States actively attempting to overthrow the results of a democratic election, and there's just no comparison in my mind between the two.
Well,
One of them are, what you were describing were obvious instances of disorder and law breaking that needed to be dealt with in an orderly and lawful way to restore order. And in cities like Portland and Seattle that look the other way, shame on this or that mayor or governor and so on. But a president of the United States doing what Trump did is simply unforgivable. And I don't think the Republican Party is going to heal itself until it comes to grips with just how unforgivable the president's behavior was from the day of the election to the day he finally walked out of office.
I gotta let Shamika talk, but my only concern is I don't disagree with anything you said. My issue is you didn't address what I'm talking about. None of that Trump's telling an 8-year-old you can change your gender, but don't tell your parents. None of that Trump's my son coming on. I've had 3 meetings with the principal already. None of that Trump.
You've had 3 separate teachers come out as some kind of unique gender to your kid.
I'm gonna teach him drag today. The whole you haven't seen this kind of stuff. The whole bragging. They're sending me emails from the school, so it's not made up stuff. They send it from the school bragging about how they're gonna start teaching the black kids differently, right? This stuff doesn't happen under Trump. It doesn't happen.
We
not
are
going to be
arguing
condoned
over
under
what
Trump.
kind of bad thing is worse, right? But we have no argument over the fact that what is being taught to young children today is obscene and
Right,
obscene.
but we know who's condoning it. That's my issue. The president, you said what the president did that day was so bad. The president got in 4 days in, telling me, I'm going to sign these executive orders for the blacks. I'm going to sign these executive orders to do this. Race is going to be in the military. I'm going to promote based on race. Look at all the ladies I got back here. Worse, I'm sorry. That's pushing an already terrible
It also
cultural
strikes
thing
me that
down
we're talking
the hill.
about 3 different things. So, I mean, like, one is the January 6th riot, which I view as an ugly, disgraceful riot. Like, I don't defend it. But my take is I object to rioting in general. And the other party, if you will, if you want to say 2 bad things, supported much larger riots throughout the entire previous year. But the second point, Brett, that you're making is Trump also attempted to reject the results of a critical election. The question, though, is, again, is that particularly unique? I mean, we've seen very prominent candidates like Stacey Abrams deny for the past couple of years that they lost elections. So I think Trump Trump, near the end of that, did embarrass himself at this. But again, I don't think the riots on the other side were better. I don't think the post-electoral behavior has been notably better. The denial of the election result, to me, was more significant than the fighting on January 6th, actually. But third, Charles is making a completely different point, which is the policies that you're seeing now would not have been implemented or would not be taking, or these things would not be taking place to the same extent if the other guy were president. That's a valid point unrelated to 1-6.
The
Well, I'm
tens
not
of
sure. I
thousand
mean,
people at the border we
I
didn't
seem to
mention.
remember
The,
these
the
issues.
DAs, the DAs is just saying let everybody out of jail. Beyond the school, the school. I mean, it would still be happening because he doesn't control that cities, but you wouldn't have the
Yeah,
federal
that's another
government
point.
condoning it. But you
I
wouldn't have
think
the federal government
that's
condoning
another
it.
story. I mean, a lot of these DAs like Cheza, whatever
Gascon
his
and
name is, Boudin in San Francisco, and the guy in LA, and so on.
Gascon in L.A.,
Gascon in
Fox
LA. Many
in
of these
Chicago.
guys, in fact, many of these guys, in some ways, were part of the progressive reaction to Trump. But that's kind of a meta story there. But this was happening during Trump and even preceding Trump. I think, look, all of us sound like we're disagreeing. We're actually just disagreeing over questions of emphasis here.
Right.
My only view is that when the president does something, it's a whole different order of magnitude than when some mayor or some DA or some school teacher at a private or public school does something. That's really what seems to be the difference between us, now. So we're arguing essentially over a whole lot of nothing.
Shamika?
So of course I don't condone violence. I don't condone people going inside the Capitol and peeing or whatever they did while they were in there. But I do feel like, as someone that was there, it has been grossly exaggerated as to what took place. I know that in 2020, while I was speaking at a rally, I had to be protected by security from a black BLM rioter man who was trying to attack me while I was speaking. I know that when I went to the acceptance speech in DC, we were attacked by BLM, rioters who were angry at anybody, regardless of color. And why are you here? You're black. You're stupid. I did not experience that when I was in DC January 6th. So to me, I had a totally different experience. And for me, that was not worse than being attacked, having to run from BLM, having your phone smashed from BLM, just being, seeing all the fires. Even when Trump was actually inaugurated, to me, that was worse than what happened on January 6th, in my opinion. And so I'm just going off my own experiences, that dealing with what I had to deal with from BLM rioters during 2020 was a lot different from what happened on January 6th, from my personal experience being there. And I could not imagine voting for Biden with what I'm seeing now in the schools. Here, we just had 7 kids shot. 2 died. One was a 15-year-old female. The crime, the homicide has gone up. This is the highest that we've ever had it. I just think that things are really, really bad right now, to the point where, more people are having to go to the food banks and can't afford food. Like, for me, that is not something that I would say, oh, I'm just Trump on the 6th outweigh all of what we're getting now. It doesn't outweigh that to me. Not saying that it wasn't bad, not saying that it wasn't embarrassing, but I do feel like it's been grossly exaggerated from someone who was actually there.
Brett, Will asked you earlier, would after a year of Biden, would you vote for him again? But I guess my thing, it seems like the biggest issue you have is January 6th. So, but I'm sure you had issues before that because you were writing about it before that. So I think the answer will be the same, even if January 6th hadn't happened and he didn't challenge the election. So,
See, I feel that Donald Trump essentially destroyed the things that I admired about the Republican Party.
oh,
And when I call myself a conservative, I call myself a conservative kind of in a liberal tradition. That is to say, you can argue there are 2 strains of conservatism. There's kind of a blood and soil type conservatism, European reactionary conservatism, even Burkean conservatism. And then there's the American tradition, that what conservatives are trying to conserve is the, properly speaking, liberal tradition that is based in liberty.
right.
That starts with the principles in the Declaration of Independence, continues with Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, all the way up until the modern conservative movement, the principles of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, that idea of a liberal world order that needs institutions like religion, the family, free enterprise, and so on to protect that tradition, that liberty making tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was objecting to Trump back in 2015 because he seemed to me much more in the mold of nationalist European reactionaries than he was in the mold of the Ronald Reagan conservatism that I kind of was my foundation, as a young conservative. So from the very beginning, I think that Trump was beginning to strip away basic principles in the Republican Party on free trade, on internationalism. A lot of the policies that actually we are now condemning with Joe Biden actually originated or were championed by Trump. I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a catastrophic disgrace that Biden, in my view, pig-headedly insisted on going through with. But that was a deal negotiated by Mike Pompeo. Let's be honest about this. One of the reasons we have such terrible inflation is that we've had interest rates in this country that have been too low for way too long. That's under Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve, who is a Trump appointee who got his job because he basically was in favor of a low interest rate regime. So preceding January 6th, preceding the election denialism, there's no other term I can think for it, and I usually hate the term denialism. Preceding all that, my objections to Trump as a conservative, or as a kind of conservative of the Reaganite tradition, were just basic. And what I'd like to do is get a Republican Party back that I recognize, that is arguing from a place of, from a set of principles that are in their spirit fundamentally liberal. And I just don't see that with Trump.
Well, do the Democrats do the Democrats represent any of those things you just tore out? 'Cause all
No,
the things you
no. The
listed,
Democrats, the
and they're
Democrats
in
were
fact
never my
worse on it
Democrats were never my party. They were not my party,
I
right?
know, but they're
Okay.
worse on those things than the GOP. I'm not talking Trump. They're worse on those things than the GOP, right?
Well, I think Brett's pretty frankly said he hates both parties right now. And I
Well,
think that's where an unfortunate number of people are. That's
That's
actually
true.
an interesting starting point for a different conversation.
Right, right.
Well,
Yeah.
no, but Will puts it very well. And as a matter of fact, one of my columns this year was titled "America Needs a Liberal Party," and by liberal I don't mean left wing. I mean liberal like John Stuart Mill liberalism. I mean that tradition. There's a great essay by Friedrich Hayek called "Why I'm Not a Conservative," and most people think of Hayek as a conservative economist. But Hayek was, in the European sense, a genuine liberal, and that in that sense speaks for me. By the way, you asked me earlier, Charles, about the term neoconservative,
Right.
and it's a theme I've been thinking about writing a column about. Neoconservative was a term applied by left-wingers against former left-wingers who had kind of tilted to the right, people like
Right.
Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I kind of hate all these labels, and I particularly hate the way in which words, I mean, a lot of what passes for left-wing politics today is what I call semantic capture. They just grab a word and they claim that they own it. So, environment. I mean, what a joke. Are traditional conservatives against cleaner air or cleaner water? Of course, everyone depends on these resources for their life and health. No one is against it, but somehow they've captured the word environment. Progressive. Typically, the word progressive means, forward-looking, right? But modern day progressives want us to return to a 19th century version of Marxism. I don't know how that is vaguely progressive, right? A lot of what passes for liberalism in this country today is an argument for a large mother state that is the antithesis of what liberalism is supposed to be about. Democracy has become the new catchword of the left. Like somehow, if someone you don't like gets elected, it's anti-democratic, right? So this is a basic problem I have with all of these words. When I call myself a conservative, what I really mean is that I'm a traditional liberal, right? In an old-fashioned sense of the term. But every single label is kind of stupid because at the end of the day, any thinking person isn't just choosing a trash bag of politics with this, that, and the
Right.
other stuffed into the bag. You think for yourself. You sometimes have different views on different subjects. Not all of these things need to cohere. What I'd like to do is attempt to think for myself on one issue after the next and arrive at conclusions which seem consistent.
That's what most of us do here. But so how do we get out of this? How do we solve this? The culture issue. The culture continues to shift to the left. Things are getting crazy. Both parties. We all agree both parties sucks. You're not getting your Liberty Party, at least not anytime soon. So what do we do?
Ask Will. By the way, this is the first time I've ever met Will, but I've been reading him for a long time, and you're such a fantastic essayist. I don't mean to be
You didn't meet Will in Boston?
fanboyish. No, we've never met, but I just want
Oh, I thought you. He was in Boston at the event where we.
Yeah,
The
I think
education.
we were just moving toward different planes. But
Oh.
first of all, thank you, Brett. I returned the compliment. Obviously, my actual opinion on this. First of all, I think the semantic or the semiotic point about the left is a lot more important than most people realize. That sounds almost like a joke, but it's not. I've said
On the
in
language.
speeches that a serious advantage the left has is that most of the English teachers and rhetoric professors are on their side. I stole that line from Eric Smith, but it's pretty accurate. You frequently see words that sound like other words being deployed, like equity for equality, and this is very, very effective if people don't know what they're looking for. But in terms of politics, what we need in terms of the parties, I would describe myself as a shit has to work conservative. Like, I grew up in the hood in the 1990s, and I mean, people, sometimes including friends and partners of mine, would get on trains and start having sex or smoking weed. Guys would get on with markers and spray cans and, decorate the scenery in that beautiful way we saw in Chicago and New York and DC back in this period. And after that, after high school, I spent a short period of time in the developing world with American Field Service, trying to do a small amount of good, also a JV touristy sort of way. But you see the same thing in underdeveloped countries. People will just openly say, like, the bus won't be here for 2 days, or you can't go down that road. There are bandits. So I, as I grew into adulthood, wanted the opposite of that. What I want the state to do is basic things like limit crime, keep out unwanted migrants, so on down the line. So that's kind of my perspective. And I thought Trump said a lot of dumb, jackassy things that reminded me of guys I'd known on trading floors. But I actually didn't have a huge problem with a lot of Trump's policies. The basic idea that illegal aliens that wanted to enter the country would have to wait in another country and be vetted struck me as just sort of common sense. The idea that you should lock up or kill criminals strikes me as just common sense. In terms of Biden, like, obviously Trump was imperfect on a lot of things. But the question when people say, well, a lot of these are Trump policies or even Obama policies that led to what we're seeing now. And you see this argument a lot when you're debating any member of the intelligentsia, like it's complicated. Don't be a rube. Don't be a rustic. It's sophisticated. The obvious question, though, is a simple one, and it's why'd this stuff start just after Biden got into office? I mean, in terms of immigration, crime, the things we're discussing, I don't think there's any argument that Trump's policies would have had the same effect. Even something like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I mean, Trump himself has said, whether or not you like that idea, we would have done it in order so that citizens of the USA, allied interpreters, so on, would have left first. I mean, there's some pretty obvious things like getting control of the airfield there that Biden didn't do, or his administration, his military didn't do, that led to what we saw. But what would I do about the parties?
No, if they want to comment on that, that's fine. But when I said what did we do, I didn't mean the parties because the parties are
What do we
crap.
do as citizens?
Yeah, I mean the culture, just the cultural shift. If we can't fix what the problems are through the two parties that we have, and we're not getting a new one in the next 3 years, what do we do about the crime, the schools, the language of the left controlling what's going on at the college campuses, all that madness?
Last slide for me, but I think a lot of the answer there has to do with what John Dewey called the public square. I mean, get active, get involved. Like the moms movement, like it or
They're
not.
shouting you out the public square.
What's up?
I said they're shouting you out of the public square.
Well, hopefully not.
Racist,
I'm sure it'll happen to me at some point.
racist.
But no, one actual serious line about that, like as the semiotics point, I don't think that we've seen a massive cultural shift at all. I mean, I'm going to use the cliche article here, but they recently, large in study, they set down a bunch of normal, mostly working class Hispanics and asked them what they thought of terms like Latinx. And 2% of them liked them. And 30 or 35% of them, you guys might correct me, said they would openly vote against any candidate that talked like this because they would view them as an out-of-touch moron. So I don't think that we're talking about a large number of people. I
Oh,
think
without a
that,
doubt.
yeah, I think that,
I'm not sure. So you're right, and you weren't talking about a large number of people when the Bolsheviks
Yeah,
launched their
they
revolution in
control
October
enough
of
stuff.
1917. But the effect of it, that's what I mean, the effect of it has been vast. I mean, in the late 1960s, it's not like everyone became a hippie, right? And dropped acid and hung out at Woodstock, but the country changed in a fundamental way. I mean, what you've seen is the capture of one institution after another by people whose values are just radically at odds with traditional or typical liberalism, never mind typical conservatism. And in all of these institutions, the people who are in charge and were supposed to know better more or less rolled over. You know, this is one of the reasons that this is a somewhat separate subject where I don't like the term cancel culture. I call it coward culture because without the cowards, there would be no cancellation. Without people who bow to the pressure of a Twitter mob here or there, all of this would have gone away. That being said, you know, just sort of the basic assumptions of a lot of our many of our cultural institutions have just changed so dramatically in such a short span of time. You know, I don't know if you know this. I grew up in Mexico City. You know, I'm a native Spanish speaker. Like the term Latin X is so preposterous to me. I mean, preposterous. It's a gendered language. Spanish and all Romance languages are
Exactly.
fundamentally
You have
gendered
to
languages.
put an X on everything.
And by the way, guess what? A lot of immigrant communities are basically conservative communities. The Latino community that I know, the Hispanos that I know, all over the greater New York area, are not woke progressives. They are hardworking, working class, family value oriented, usually quite religious people. Their shift towards the Republican Party, by the way, is going to be massive over the next few election cycles. But there has been, I think, a cultural revolution. I think there's now going to be a cultural counter revolution, is my guess. And Glenn Youngkin's election in Virginia is the kind of the leading edge of that wave. I'm sort of rambling, but I guess it's one point that gives me some optimism that there are self-correcting mechanisms in the American system that are going to be asserting themselves fairly soon. And I guess this answers your question, Charles. Those self-correcting mechanisms are going to give us a type of politics that we recognize as normal. I don't know if you heard London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, was just speaking. Was it today, yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah.
Basically giving a law and order speech worthy of Richard Nixon. So things will change.
Right. I mean, I think I'll let Shamika get in, but I think I'm somewhere between you and Will. I think I'm a little more concerned than Will because I agree with him. He's right. It's a small number of people, but if they're loud and they control everything, it doesn't matter. But I'm somewhat optimistic because I know the pendulum has to reach its apex. I think it's going to get worse before it does. But that's my issue to your point, Brett, is I do think it'll get, and I agree. What you said about many of the in the Latino community, it's the same as the black community. They have some of those same concerns. None of my normal friends buy into this crap. However, they also don't know what's going on. I just got off the phone with my brother. His kids are grown. I tell him what's going on in schools. He's like, "What?" He's like, "But glad my kids are grown," and he thinks it won't affect him. So we have to find a way to get him to see that. Well, those crazy kids are going to grow up after being indoctrinated and run a business or be a lawyer, be a judge, make policy in your neighborhood, it's still going to affect you. But a lot of people either just feel, disenchanted or it doesn't really concern them or they just don't watch the news, right? I often tell these people when I talk to other podcasters, you're a journalist, you write, you get it, not to bring us down a notch, but I'm like, well, we all are really successful and we're doing our thing. But last time I checked, Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson were pretty much the top viewed shows on cable news on each side. They only got 5 million viewers. It's 330 million people in the country. Everybody's not paying attention. I talk to people who consider themselves, in the know, and they pay attention to education and raise, 50-year-old black man who never heard of Kendi. So, I mean, we got a long ways to go. But the good thing about it, what I see the silver lining is I don't think that the left has a built-in disdain for the normals. So they're never even going to try to reach them because they're like, those people don't matter. We just sit up here and we write our policies and we do our thing, write our 1619 books and, we'll run the country. If somebody could reach, 3% of those people, it'd be huge. But I don't know how to do it. They're not in the same place, as it was 40 years ago. They're not at church. They're not watching the same TV shows. They're not all watching one channel, so it's hard to reach them. But when you can, I think you just got to talk to people in your circle. But Shamika, you've been silent for a while. I know you have something for me.
So I agree with what you were saying as far as the black community having the same values as the Hispanic. And I think that's one of the things that I would like to work on as far as getting the culture to shift or getting people to see things differently. Is I want the black community to understand that many times most of us are conservative and we aren't with the policies that we've been voting for that have really brought in our demise as a community. So I think you're right. The people that may be a smaller group, they are the loudest. And I don't have an issue with, people coming after me. I think my issue when I say cancel culture is the fact that a lot of these social media platforms don't allow us to speak when they feel as if, like, for me, I know that my reach could be even greater, but if you are shadow banning or if you are keeping me from going live because you don't like what I'm saying, if you are deleting my post, if you are banning me for 30 days every time I turn around, like that to me is cancel culture. You're not allowing me to get the word out because I'm not going to cower. That's not me. I'm not scared. I'm not afraid. So that's how I feel about cancel culture. And when we talk about what's happening with the children and the indoctrination, I was just saying earlier today that Martin Luther King said in one of his writings, The Purpose of Education, if we're not careful, colleges are going to produce a group of people who are closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists. And that's exactly what we have coming out of these schools, now going into these schools as teachers, teaching our young people a bunch of foolishness. So I do think even with those of us like myself, my youngest is 16. I'm almost out of this. She's taking all college classes. I don't have to deal with a lot of what I see, but I do understand that if I'm not active, these young people that are being taught this are going to grow up and have to be in a world with my daughter and my grandchildren. And so I do think we have to continue to fight and be loud. And I'm grateful that I'm seeing a lot of people that say, I don't care who's on the ticket. If it's a Democrat, I'm not voting for him.
Well, I guess if us or Will or Brett have a follow up, I have one final question. But if either of you want to follow up on any one of those points, mine or hers.
Brett, first to you. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think that something very specific is going on with the small minority of people in this country that are launching the quote-unquote woke revolution. And it's something that Antonin Gramsci, the communist strategist, actually advised a long time ago. I mean, he said that what he called Reds then were pretty unlikely to take power in most sectors, industry, the military, so on, although we've seen some attempts. So the important thing to do was to control discourse, to kind of send people into academia, the media as it existed then, sort of the NGO sector. And that's really where this is concentrated right now. I mean, the most recent data I looked at as an academic showed that, at least at highly ranked universities, the ratio of liberal to conservative sociologists or progressive to conservatives like 108 to 1. So I think you're seeing this at a very high level. There basically are two responses in terms of how can normal citizens, especially on the right, reply. I mean, the first is get competitive in these institutions ourselves, or set up alternative institutions. And you see a lot of rightist media outlets like the Daily Wire really trying to do this. The second is kind of block the information that's coming from the discursive sector before it gets to normal people. And that's the goal of kind of the moms movement. Like, you can't teach this in the schools. I personally think that a lot of the groups that are being established now, FAIR, 1776 Unite, so on, have a pretty good chance in this arena, because a question you hear a lot as why people would pay attention to the SPLC or something is, well, there doesn't seem to be a sane, up middle class kind of not religious right alternative. And I think if there is, the huge majority of people will find out they like listening to it.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Look, I'm never on the side of suppressing discourse, which is like, I am not against teaching critical race theory as one theory among many. In the way that, when I was an undergraduate, I learned about Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm glad I can understand what it is, right? So I believe these things belong in a universe if they are taught explicitly as one perspective among many, right? And giving young minds an option to think these things through and understand them. Where my objection lies is when they are being taught as if they are the only perspective. And that's the problem that I have with a lot of what's transpiring in, never mind undergraduate education, grade school education. But Will made a point which is, I think, fundamental, which is, I think, I'm using the term in the typical sense, conservatives can more than compete in the marketplace of ideas. And we have been remiss in our failure to do so in a variety of arenas outside of, say, Fox News and Wall Street Journal's editorial page and a handful of other outlets, podcasts like this. There is no real competition. I don't know what's going to happen with the University of Austin, but there has been no real competition in academia. Nothing prevents conservative philanthropists from doing what John D. Rockefeller did with the University of Chicago, or Leland Stanford with Stanford University, one place after another, and start chartering schools based on a different set of principles with different educational philosophies. We ought to be doing that. There is a Substack revolution taking place where suddenly writers, some of them who used to be quite liberal, like Andrew Sullivan, or my old friend Barry Weiss, are taking up raising the flag and establishing what amount to genuinely competitive, interesting, increasingly diversified forms of media to take on establishment institutions which seem to have been captured by again, I'm using the term, the woke sensibility, just because everyone understands what I mean by it. So there's actually a real field for competition here that we are only beginning to seize, and it's podcasts like this that allow us to do more to seize it. It's one of the reasons I love participating in them.
Well, I only have one last question because I don't know
And
how
I say this as a paid up member of the elite media, by the way.
Right. The last question though, because I left out this group of people, which I push for. I mean, I think I'm one of the few people out there that talks about it constantly, but I think it's important. And we all, because of our demographics, you living in New York and writing where you write, the three of us being black, and that's the liberals. I think that there's a large percentage of liberals who would, like you said, you whisper with some of your friends who say, I would never vote for a Republican. I never have. But if they keep calling me racist every day, if they keep pushing this stuff, I think as hard as it is to get to the normal people that aren't paying attention, there's a pretty sizable number of liberals who are paying attention who aren't liking what they're seeing. So I think that we have to find a way, and it's easier to get to them. Now, convincing them won't be as easy, but it's easier to get to them because they're already watching the news and they're already seeing deception and they're already having a problem with policies. To get them not to make them Republicans, that's never been my goal because I'm not a Republican, but to understand that to separate, in fact, stay a Democrat, separate yourself from them and loudly say, I'm not a progressive, and they are losing their minds and they don't represent me. Like you said, don't be a coward. So do you agree that there should be a movement where we try to, I don't know, shake some life into those people and get them to speak up?
Look, I think that is going to materialize in time. But and in time, I mean in the next few months, because I think it's happening faster than...
In really quick order.
Well, it's happening really fast when suddenly more and more liberals are coming to grips with the fact that what passes for progressivism is a kind of a new species of racialist totalitarianism that's, I mean, I've never liked the term un-American because it sounds so McCarthyite. But if the term American has some fundamentally positive connotation, as I believe it does, in a concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in a belief in fair play, in a belief in fundamental tenets of equality of opportunity and being judged on the content of our character. I've said this before, but it's just plainly antithetical to those convictions we were brought up with, right? That's what it used to mean to be a good liberal, to believe what I just said. And now we are being told by this new, it's not even a movement, it's almost a religion, to believe the opposite of these things. And I think that's going to shake the foundations of the Democratic Party. I think it's going to crack the Democratic Party in two. I've been saying this for well over a year. And that's going to happen much sooner than people think. A lot of people who have never before voted for anyone but a Democrat are going to be looking much harder at their ballots next time around than they did in previous voting cycles.
Wow. Well, I don't think we need to add anything to that. I just hope that, one, that you're right, but I hope that it goes beyond the ballot box, and whatever they do there, that they get involved and actively join those moms Will was talking about, join Shamika trying to do outreach and get people to speak up against the things they don't like they did against Trump. So if Biden's president and you don't like what he's doing, don't wait till the next election. Tell him that you don't like what he's doing. And I think that that will go a long way. Well, we've definitely had a lively and spirited debate and conversation, and I truly appreciate you. He is Bret Stephens, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and New York Times columnist. Bret, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure getting to know you and seeing that real bow tie on you.
From you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.